Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our weekly philosophical talks with S.Friedman. We're really glad to see you all. And first of all, we would like to give big thanks to our amazing speaker, S.Friedman, who is the scientist, the New York Times acclaimed great philosopher and artist, and also great speaker of ours. And also, we would like to give big thanks to the US Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and also you, the audience, for joining us weekly. Please make sure to give your feedback, ask your questions, and we will definitely address them next week. Stephen?
Thank you so much, Aaliyah, again for the introduction, as always. I also want to extend my appreciation to the American Space Almaty, the entire team, the entire staff, Dana, Elmira, everyone who makes these talks possible, who provides this platform for addressing philosophical issues of a wide range of concerns. It's an unusual platform. I mean, I was just talking with Aaliyah, and I'm not aware of similar talks, being conducted anywhere at the moment. Certainly not with my particular philosophical perspective, which is a comprehensive one, and one that doesn't depend upon belief or opinion or point of view, but attempts to ground everything of consequence philosophically in rigorous representation, which is what achieves the highest level of embrace, of esteem in the intellectual world today. So it's, I think, an unusual opportunity to be afforded this space and this platform. I am deeply appreciative, and I hope you are deriving enjoyment, benefit, insight, perspective, from these weekly excursions into a wide range of topics. Today's talk is occasioned, as these talks often are, by an international day. In this instance, May 1st, among other significances of May 1st, is World Laughter Day. Now, I've given a talk before on humor. I've emphasized, I think, that even if I gave a talk each week on the same topic, it would be fundamentally different, because there's so much to say about any given topic and so many different ways to approach, whatever the issue is, the topic is, the concern is. So there will be things that I will say today that I've probably said before in other contexts, but that is one of the main ways that we achieve understanding. We achieve illumination by approaching things repeatedly and from slightly different points of view or perspectives, slightly different avenues of approach. That's the theory behind my writing of the aphorisms. I have, as I've mentioned, about 20,000 aphorisms, concentrated statements of philosophical insight, and each one is seeing a central core of understanding from a slightly different position, a slightly different angle. And what I found is that I never know who might respond to which aphorism, but I find that there are individual aphorisms that seem to provoke a deep response and deep understanding from individuals, so that you don't necessarily need to come to terms with everything I'm saying. If you respond forcefully, deeply to one formulation, that is giving you a key to the totality of my work. Well, the subtitle for today's talk is Laughter Precedes Enlightenment. So clearly the focus is going to be on, if you like, the epistemic dimension of laughter, its relationship to deep insight, deep understanding at the level of Buddhist enlightenment. Now, I've emphasized repeatedly that these talks have no more to do with religion or religious systems than they have to do with scientific elaborations. Science and religion have more in common than either does with philosophy. That's why there's often conflict between science and religion. They are both systems of belief. We recognize religious belief. We talk of belief in scientific results ultimately because we can't do incontestable, rigorously controlled experiments that will decide incontestably a scientific claim. In addition, scientific claims have reference to future events, future possibilities, and rigorously, you can make no claim about the future. The past cannot guarantee the future. The future, in fact, works retroactively and decides our sense of the past. Well, now, laughter, it turns out, has not been well explored philosophically. There have been some attempts, and I'm going to discuss those, but it shouldn't come as a surprise, certainly not from my background, that laughter plays a central role and an elevated role in philosophical inquiry and understanding. I've cited in the past that famous joke by the pre-Socratic philosopher Thales. Life is no different than death, then why don't you die? Because it makes no difference. Which is it's pre-Socratic, so it's prior to the real emergence of the epistemology, the focus on how we know what we think we know, that became the essence of the Socratic enterprise and is central to the entire Western philosophical tradition, is central to my work, right? And I've often cited the aphorism, we suffer not because of what we know, not because of what we do not know, not because of what we cannot know, but because of what we think we know, unjustifiably. That in itself has a humorous element, or can be expressed humorously. I should tell you the story briefly of a professor at Harvard, Walter Jackson Bate. He was an authority on 18th century English literature, and in particular on the work of Samuel Johnson, that great English man of letters and great moralist. Bates's course at Harvard was one of the most highly attended of all the courses. It always was held in a very large lecture hall, and the lecture hall was always filled to overflowing. The aisles were filled with students. I attended, I think, virtually every lecture of that course, even though I wasn't enrolled in the course. I was just what they call auditing the course because his lectures were so compelling. Well, one day he wanted to make a point that I think it's valuable to make here. Anything can be made funny. Anything can be presented in such a way, presented in such a context that it comes across more humorously or fundamentally humorously than in any other way. And to make that point, one day he read to us a famous poem from the 18th century, Thomas Gray's Elegy in a Country Courtyard, which is a poem about death and is one of the most serious and somber poems that one can find in English literature. In fact, it ends with a very famous stanza, the heraldry of pomp, the boasts of power, all that beauty, all that wealth e'er gave, await alike the inevitable hour. The paths of glory lead but to the grave. Somber, but he recited it in such a way that it was hilarious. And that made the point. And it was a point that I've never forgotten. Now, in many contexts, one can represent serious ideas in terms of comedy, in terms of humor. Phaleris' Bull, Solving the Order of the Great Big World, that play I did in New York, has humor in it. In fact, some of the reviews commented upon its humor. But even though it has humorous elements, for example, one thing, and then I met a book. The title told me it was science. I was wrong. Or I talk about how my ex-wife moved out because I had failed to acknowledge, Valentine's Day. It was the culmination of a lot of difficulties that we had in our marriage, in our relationship. And I made a comment that, the point was, never forget Valentine's Day. In the United States, Valentine's Day is a significant occasion. So, especially for people in relationships. Anyway, so there are like moments of humor, throughout the play. Even the opening, which is somber and is typically an opening that I deliver with some weight, some gravity. Kierkegaard, the philosopher Kierkegaard tells the story of Phaleris' bull, an ancient torture device, a hollow metal shell, inside which a victim is slowly roasted alive. But it's so designed that we hear the screams as music. See? It's somber, it's horrific in principle. It opens the play because I'm interested in addressing, as Christianity addresses, as Buddhism addresses, the worst of human experience, and seeing if philosophy can rise to that occasion. But still, it can be delivered in a way that's funny. Wittgenstein once commented that he thought a major work of philosophy could be written entirely of jokes. And in a work as serious as probing as the philosophical investigations, there is humor. Or there's certainly a lot of humor in Wittgenstein's writings in and around that book. I'm not sure if what I'm going to say from Wittgenstein's work right now is in the investigations. I haven't read it in a number of years now, but he made the comment, either in the investigations or somewhere else. He asked the question, why doesn't a lion feign emotion? Why doesn't a lion pretend? Is he too honest? Humor. Well, the deepest aspect of humor, of laughter, obviously, is the laughter that precedes enlightenment, the laughter that conjoins with the deepest understanding, the deepest, in the case of religion, in the case of Buddhism, the deepest spiritual insight into the nature of our condition, of our circumstances, and what resolves the anguish, the suffering, the dukkha of those circumstances. I will get to that, but I wanted to address what has been more often addressed in the history of philosophy, what we might call heuristic dimension to laughter. In fact, when I've looked through some major philosophical writings on laughter, that's all I see addressed, the heuristic role or dimension. I'm going to make clear what that is and what the limitations of that point of view are, or at least of that aspect of laughter. So we're going to find that laughter can serve a variety of functions. It can serve an instrumental role, a heuristic role, within our social lives, and it can serve the role as a signifier of the deepest understanding, the deepest insight, and the deepest liberation from our presumptions, our unjustifiable claims. And it's not unusual for human responses to take on a variety of meanings, of significations, of roles within our life. What came to mind as I was thinking about this aspect of the talk is the issue of touch. Touch is one of our strongest senses. It's often underappreciated simply because our evolution has taken a direction where it's not as vital to life and death. But if, as evolutionary theory contends, we lived in arboreal life. At one time, we lived in trees. Well, the life of organisms in trees depends most upon two senses: sight and touch. Sight that can distinguish between empty space and the solid support of the branch of a tree, and touch that can grasp. So, touch plays actually maybe an underappreciated role in our lives, partly because of its evolutionary significance that is no longer as vital when we're walking on solid ground. But there's a famous remark, and we know that touch can be used aggressively. We know that if we're in a confrontational setting, to reach out and touch someone is a serious violation of personal space that can easily escalate a conflict, can easily make something that was just a matter of words into something that can come to blows, can come to physical violence. Just the significance even of a tap. But in other contexts, like in a pedagogical context, a teaching context, I used to do a lot of private tutoring, private teaching, one-on-one with students. A cousin of mine that I've quoted before once said wisely, the only true teaching is one-on-one, because everything can be tailored to the needs, the concerns, the demands of the individual student. I would work with now, these days I still help people, but remotely. Technology allows that very effectively, and the pandemic made it a wiser choice. But when I would help people in person, often, if there was something that the student would understand, that I was like trying to get across, and suddenly they understood and they conveyed that understanding in words or some other way, I might touch them on the arm or tap them on the shoulder. I found that just that little tap in that learning context, that context of instruction, could help reinforce the understanding. And then, of course, there's the famous remark by the chess master, Bobby Fischer, whose last words, apparently, were, "Nothing soothes pain like the touch of another." So touch has a variety of significations, within human life. Everything from the incendiary, to provoking conflict, to soothing as nothing else can. In the same way, laughter has this range of roles, from basically the way I would summarize it within the context of my work, from the epistemic, aligned with the deepest insight, the deepest understanding, and the heuristic, something that plays a more societal role. Now, and remember, let me just recapitulate here, as I always like to do. When we're talking about heuristics, the top one, we're talking about societal spaces. We're talking about spaces in which two individuals are approximately the same, two objects are approximately the same, two living things are approximately the same as human beings for some purpose, for some social consideration, under aspects of social law, expectation. And then, of course, epistemically, we're talking about a space of radical distinction. One of the important aspects of the heuristic is it's a convergent space. Things are brought together within heuristic space. Concepts represent a bringing together of distinctive objects within groupings. Remember, an epistemic space is radically distinct, a divergent space. When we are talking about society, we are talking about a convergent structure, a bringing together of elements, or the recognition of distinct elements within some grouping. That is, by one definition, heuristic. It also represents, when we're talking about heuristic space, something that is oriented towards goal achievement. We're trying to achieve a certain result. There is a value, a goal to be gained. In the case of society, we gain survival, right? I've mentioned it. Pascal noted that individual human beings, at the dawn of human evolution, were vulnerable in many ways to predators. We didn't have the physical strength to fight off predators like a lion, a tiger, a bear. But social groupings gave us a survival advantage. And within those social groupings, the means of societal coordination was ultimately language. And language not only facilitates societal coordination, but becomes a conveyor of ideas, becomes a medium of ideas. And those ideas help us to elaborate ultimately technologies that are themselves convergent structures. So, laughter has a role within these convergent structures, these social structures, these heuristic structures. And remember, one of the main things about heuristics is they serve survival, not what religions call salvation. So the rigor of philosophical representation underlies or can express the aspiration of religious systems. Societies operate in a different direction, right? The direction of helping us survive day to day. Well, there is a philosopher, Henri Bergson, in a 19th, early 20th century French philosopher who wrote a celebrated work on laughter. I have some images I should show. Well, first, the Buddha, right? We're talking about laughter preceding enlightenment, and that's associated with Buddhism and the work of the Buddha. Here is Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, who wrote a book on laughter. And it was a book that I actually read when I was in college, but not with tremendous enthusiasm. And when I looked back at it in preparation for this talk, I could see why. I'm going to read you a couple of things, a couple of excerpts that capture the central ideas of the book. Let me get this here. Okay. So, this is Bergson, who, by the way, won a Nobel Prize for literature for his philosophical work. But winning a Nobel Prize doesn't necessarily mean that you represent the highest level of philosophical achievement. Wittgenstein did not win a Nobel Prize. Laughter is, above all, a corrective. Being intended to humiliate, it must make a painful impression on the person against whom it is directed. By laughter, society avenges itself for the liberties taken with it. It would fail in its object if it bore the stamp of sympathy or kindness. He's talking about laughing at people. He's talking about laughing as an aggressive act, a hostile act. Obviously, an act meant to help control behavior, correct behavior, as he says, a corrective. This is an instrumental use of laughter, right? Laughter that's helping society maintain its order, maintain its equilibrium, preventing individuals from becoming too odd, too eccentric, acting too outside the norm that threatens the norm of the society, that challenges its basic integrity, is a threat. And so laughter is a means of attacking and neutralizing that threat. It's a violent conception of laughter, right? And he said, and designed to humiliate, to undermine the dignity of. I mean, it's hard to imagine anything worse from the perspective of what I emphasize, human dignity, which is central, not just to the philosophic vision, central to the nature of epistemic space, the true reality, right? That any 2 points, any 2 individuals are rigorously distinct, and so in principle, epistemically irreplaceable, and so inviolate in dignity. Well, obviously, those considerations don't apply within the approximations of societal spaces. And so laughter can be adopted, can be exercised to help facilitate the end of those spaces, which again is in the opposite direction to human dignity, the opposite direction to the ultimate solution to the human condition, which lies in the embrace of our fundamental circumstances, our incontestable circumstances, the dignity of each individual. There's a character in Shakespeare. It just came to mind, so I don't remember the character. I think it's in one of the history plays, but I'd have to look it up. The character is humiliated. The character is he's caught in a series of lies, and so he's utterly humiliated. And after that humiliation, his resolve, and remember, Shakespeare is somebody who really has a strong sense of the dignity of the individual. The character says famously, "Simply the thing I am shall make me live." When all else is gone in terms of social esteem, social embrace, one has been humiliated to one's core, well, there remains, if one can seize it, if one can grasp it, and again, the point of philosophy is partly to point this out, there remains that inviolate core of dignity by which we exist at all. But society has its own ends of survival, again, running oppositely to the ends of ultimate salvation, a complete solution to our circumstances here and now. A couple of other things in that vein from Bergson's work. Laughter is the corrective force which prevents us from becoming cranks. Again, a crank is, I guess, maybe an alternative translation of that might be eccentric, overly eccentric. But let me see, there's another comment here too in that vein. The only cure for vanity is laughter, and the only fault that is laughable is vanity. Thinking too much of oneself, but again, that's something that one can only do within a social context. One can't think too much of oneself epistemically because one can't ever leave one's epistemic circumstance. Now, when I hear those kinds of comments, and again, Bergson is analyzing not laughter broadly, but laughing at people and the role that actually rather narrow application of laughter has. What comes to my mind is the circumstance of the young Isaac Newton, who in his 20s designed the first reflecting telescope. He had ideas on the nature of light, the nature of optics, that actually ran counter to the prevailing ideas of Robert Hooke, who was the president of the Royal Society in England at the time, the main scientific organization that had been founded to help advance the development of science and scientific ideas. Well, Newton went down. Newton, I think, wrote to the Royal Society and said he had this telescope. They were interested. They received him. He went down to London. Newton didn't travel much in his lifetime. I think his main travels were from Cambridge University to London and back, on various occasions. But he went to the Royal Society in London and he presented his telescope to great acclaim. Everybody was extremely enthusiastic about what he had designed, invented. But then he asked if he could read a paper on optics, on his theory of the nature of light, which he did to great ridicule, to laughter, because his ideas ran counter to the ideas of Robert Hooke, the prevailing ideas of the time. Newton was seen, his ideas were seen as those of a crank, right, within the realm of ideas. The result of that, laughter, being laughed at by someone as sensitive as Newton, he left London, went back to Cambridge. He resolved never to publish anything again. For the next 20 years, he sat on the scientific revolution. I've talked about how one of the main reasons one can say, one can't ever do the controlled experiments to validate this. But one of the main reasons why one can say, well, why don't we have a fully functioning cancer cure? Well, a Roman soldier slew Archimedes, the French guillotined Lavoisier, and the British Royal Society laughed at the young Newton. And so we lost, in the case of Archimedes, 2 millennia. In the case of Newton, we lost a generation. So I think Bergson probably was not aware of that historical circumstance surrounding Newton and his work and the history of his revealing of that work to the world and the consequence of that initial encounter. So we have to be careful, right, when it comes to laughing. Oh, okay, I think we might have temporarily lost, but we're back. Okay. Philosophy is more concerned with the absolute dignity of the individual than it is with serving societal ends. But there is a case where serving the societal end did not serve the societal end, right? It brought us in the opposite direction. We lost more than we gained through that exercise of laughter. There's, and again, when we talk about laughing at in that way, when we're talking about laughter as a corrective, we are talking about it heuristically, right? We're not talking about the ultimate meaning and value of it as the subtitle of the talk points to, right? That the laughter that precedes enlightenment. Now, when I was young, and just to show you how devastating that exercise of laughter can be, how vulnerable we are as human beings to its exercise. I remember being, 7 or 8, being invited to birthday parties, and there was a game that we would play, a game. It didn't last very long because it was so devastating in its consequences. But the game was, there was a group of people at the party, maybe 20 people. We'd select an individual would volunteer. It was a game. We were playing. An individual would stand in the middle of the room, and everybody would form a circle around that person, point at the person, and laugh. As a game. Even though it was recognized as a contrived situation, even though it was pretend, even though it was a game, a party game, the person in the middle of that circle was invariably reduced to tears. The game didn't last long. I don't know how long people played that particular game, but again, its consequences were so brutal, even in a situation where we're playing, we're pretending. So our energies should probably be directed to the other aspects of laughter, the deeper aspects. There's another comment. I just wanted to give you some, I think, put Bergen's ideas in a slightly broader context. Which is a heuristic context. I think in the same work he said, or maybe it's in a different work, I'm not sure. The eyes only see what the mind is prepared to comprehend. A heuristic remark as well. It's actually, it interlaces with ideas from Goethe. We hear only what we understand, a famous remark that precedes Bergson's. And in the 20th century, Anais Nin's famous comment, we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. Now, these are compelling remarks, but they are compelling heuristically in the way that Bergson is pointing when he points at when he does his analysis of laughing at people as a heuristic function, a heuristic context, not a deeply and rigorously philosophic context. I've made the remark about Anais Nin that as compelling as that comment is heuristically, the epistemic response to it, the philosophic response to it is, how can you ever know? Remember, I've emphasized that the fundamental illusion, the fundamental misconception, the fundamental source, or one way of representing the fundamental source of human suffering, is that we imagine we can view the world from the outside. Our sense of reality, of an objective reality, is the world imagined from the outside, from the perspective of a God, outside the world itself. Well, the point of existentialism is that's fanciful. The point of the work of Einstein and Heisenberg, relativity and quantum mechanics, is we achieve more powerful results, more decisively powerful results, even within the sciences, when we cohere more with the epistemic, when we attempt to describe the world, describe physics, describe our interactions with the world from within the world. That achieves the greater heuristic power. That is actually one of the meanings of this third formulation that I've discussed in the past. The heuristic converges on the epistemic. It also means that the epistemic is the strongest of all heuristics, in the way that the most powerful results of physics are the realm of relativity and quantum theory, and those are physics bending to, recognizing, attempting formulations within an epistemic sense, awareness, sensibility. Remember the physicist Steven Weinberg I quoted before, at the highest level, physics becomes philosophy. At the highest level in relativity and quantum mechanics, it becomes existential philosophy, existentialism. Einstein and Heisenberg were doing the physics of existentialism. Well, those remarks by Bergson and Goethe and Anais Nin represent a heuristic contemplation that has interest. One can write books, it's stimulating in different ways, but it doesn't get to the core of our rigorous reality. And the fact that we cannot know that how we see the world is more how we are than how it is. In order to be able to make that claim rigorously, legitimately, we'd have to be outside the world, and see how different it is when we're not seeing it through our eyes. That's a fantasy. And that's a fatal fantasy, that truth is accessed ultimately and decisively through our eyes. Okay, so there are limitations to the heuristic view of laughter. The deeper sense of laughter is, again, the laughter that precedes enlightenment. And what's the significance of that? Why is there such an experience? And let me tell you, just to kind of bring it to less religious and even mythological terms. I've talked a lot about the nature of epistemic space. I've talked about the fact that epistemic space is right here, right now, in front of our eyes, that it's what we see that we cannot recognize, that we cannot name. It is the present divorced from the past. It is the world seen with fresh eyes, the eyes with which we would see the world if we were seeing it for the very first time. That sense of earliness that the Harvard professor Stanley Cavell talked about a lot late in his life and in his career. Well, the epistemic is also manifested in the sense that the world is different in different directions. It's that distinctiveness in different directions that is the impress of the epistemic upon the objective space, the recognizable space, the space of objects that, again, is a product of our past experience in being sort of processing what we're seeing presently. But to see the world in its distinctiveness, in its uniqueness, moment to moment, that is to experience the epistemic. It is, as I gave a talk once on the nature of the sublime, strange and beautiful and new. The epistemic is sublime. Well, I mentioned some time, a few talks ago, about at Harvard taking an introductory philosophy course, a seminar course, where the focus early on was in getting people to see sense data, to see the world as a mosaic of colors, not congealed into objects, a kind of attempt at experiencing the epistemic. Well, as part of my work, I've been interested, or certainly in the past, there was a time when I was especially interested in seeing things epistemically as much as possible, because I was coming to terms with it. I was writing about it. And so I developed sort of a facility at entering epistemic space, right? Kind of like seeing the world of sense data, seeing the world without objects, or seeing the world independent of the past, entering epistemic space. It's right here, right now, just a matter of seeing the world. And what was interesting to me is every time I did that, the experience had an emotional aspect to it, not just an intellectual, not just a cognitive, not just a mode of understanding, of recognition, but it had an emotional quality. And that emotional quality was characterized by three things: chills, I would get chills; tears, I would get tears, it was emotional; and laughter. Those three elements: laughter, tears, chills. And they would come about. It would be like an instantaneous emotional response to that entry into that rigorous philosophic space. That is effectively what Buddhism is describing within its forms of representation. That laughter that precedes enlightenment. As I entered into that epistemic space, I would laugh. I couldn't control it. I would get chills. I would get tears. It was an emotional experience in the way that the experience of Buddhist enlightenment is an emotional experience. Now, I attempt to represent the nature of Buddhist enlightenment through philosophical rigor. So, insofar as that representation is reasonable, well, it makes sense that the emotional accompaniments of the experience would be similar to what I've found to be true of epistemic space itself. Now, why? What is the aspect of that experience that is provoking that laughter specifically? And this is something I have explored in the past with the talk I gave on humor some time ago. And that is the idea that if the present, the world of objects, the world that we can describe, the world that we can recognize, is conditioned by the past, our experience of acting, our experience of thinking about the world is conditioned largely by expectation, right? We are projecting from the past into the future. We are anticipating. We're anticipating. I've made the, I give the analysis in Phaleris's bull about how to be a physical object, to be a pencil, to be a pair of glasses, I have to be able to reach out and pick it up. If I were to reach out and my hand passed through, well, then it wasn't an object, a physical object at all. It was an illusion, or an hallucination, or a mirage, or a dream, not a physical reality. So, but our sense of it as well, a physical object, as a pair of glasses, as we look at it, is based upon our set of expectations as to how it will behave, how it will perform, how we will be able to use it, how we will be able to make use of it, what we will be able to expect of it. That's the past. Imagine, that's ourselves imagining that the past can guarantee the future. It can't. Now, to live in terms of that separation of past from present and future, that's an intellectual challenge. That's like the challenge of entering epistemic space. That's like the challenge of seeing the world as if we were seeing it for the very first time. That's like the challenge of seeing a world that we cannot describe in terms of objects conditioned by our past experience. But it's also at the core of humor. I've given the analysis before that. A joke, in general, prepares us, sets up an expectation that the punchline of the joke counters. We have an expectation, we're expecting a certain outcome, and the joke goes in a different direction. In general, humor thwarts expectation. Well, what's the value of that? Thwarting expectation is freeing us. It's freeing us from the past. It's freeing us from our set of expectations as to the future. And remember, one of the things that is central to what rigor achieves is that truth that sets you free, right? The truth that sets one free of expectation. We laugh in the face of that liberation from expectation. It's what operates in sports events. There's in American baseball, there's been some discussion of what's called introducing a mercy rule. That if one team, like in general baseball games, have scores of 5-3, 10-7, but if a team, let's say, scores 20 runs and is leading 20-0 late in the game, well, the chances of the team that's losing making a comeback and winning is effectively 0, right? But baseball is not time limited. A baseball game can go on forever until there's a final out, as it's called. Which means that in principle, there's always the possibility of coming back, of being down 20-0 in what's called the bottom of the ninth, with 2 outs. There are 3 outs in an inning or half an inning. 1 out away, 1 strike away at the very end, but until the end is reached, there's that possibility of a comeback. Well, if a baseball team were down 20-0 in the bottom of the ninth, and they came back and scored 21 runs and won the game, that would be considered the greatest game in the history of baseball. Because the result ran so powerfully counter to expectation that we would cheer it, we would laugh at it, we would embrace it with a kind of laughter, a kind of release from the chains of expectation, which are the projection of the past into the future, even though logically, rigorously, the past cannot sustain that projection, but psychologically, we embrace it. Our minds are heuristic devices, not epistemic devices. So if we would introduce a mercy rule, we would eliminate the possibility of the greatest comeback, the greatest game, the greatest outcome in history, where every possible expectation of an outcome was denied, was thwarted, was proven wrong. And isn't that what we want about we suffer our expectations. We suffer our expectations about death, about its finality. But what do I say in Phaleris's bull? When someone dies, what do you know? That they will not return? We're convinced of that. To the end of all time? And how exactly do you know that? You're convinced of it, but how exactly do you know that rigorously? And remember, rigor is the highest possible standard, the highest possible demand. Rigor does not permit that claim. Rigor does not permit the suffering that that claim supports. That's the nature of the freedom that philosophical rigor achieves. It is stronger than any belief, anything that can in principle oppose it. It is by definition the strongest instrumentality of all. That's its power. And that's the power that laughter embraces when we see that power exercised. When we are liberated from our expectations, we become giddy at the outcome because the outcome has proven us wrong and has proven the worst of our expectations wrong. Now, this sense of expectation and the power of being freed from it is also at the core, and I've discussed this before, but I'm going to discuss it again. It's at the core of how tautologies mean. Tautologies are propositions like A equals A. A man is a man. What's interesting about tautologies, and again, I've discussed this before, but it seems that people have mentioned to me that every time they read one of my writings about tautologies or hear one of my discussions, they understand the issue better. And it's an important issue to understand. So I'm going to revisit it now. The perplexing question about a tautology, like a man is a man, is it seems to say nothing. Like a man is a man, a dog is a dog, a cat is a cat, whatever. What are we saying? But what's intriguing is that those types of propositions are used to express the deepest wisdom. That's the point of Shakespeare's arguably greatest tragedy, King Lear. King Lear thinks of himself as a king, thinks of himself, talks in the royal we. We do this, we do that. He's arrogant, he's imperious, he's insufferable. Shakespeare turns his world on his head. Shakespeare, in the course of that play, strips everything from King Lear, all of his majesty, all of the trappings of majesty, all of his trappings of power, all of his place and station and dignity. He strips it away to reveal the man, not the king, not the monarch, not the imperial royal we, but I'm a simple, fond old man, 80 and upward now, not an hour more nor less. And to deal plainly, I think I am not in my perfect mind. I think I am not in my perfect mind. He has discovered at the end of the play, having lost everything, he's gained himself. He's found himself. He's discovered something greater, the only thing of ultimate value, his central, fundamental, incontestable dignity. Well, what he's discovered is a man is a man, not a king, not not a monarch, not a leader of 10,000 troops, a man. That's the wisdom of King Lear. That's the wisdom of Shakespeare. That's the wisdom communicated in tautologies that logically A equals A seem to say nothing. So the question is, how do they mean? And they mean by a thwarting of expectation. They mean the same way that humor means, the same way that laughter arises, a denial of what we are expecting. And we can see that in the case of a tautology when we slow it down. A man is. What are we expecting? A man is, well, I have a section in the books of Joshua. I'll recite it. But we're expecting what's called a predicate, a description. A man is over there. A man is the head of a company. A man is a father. A man is something. We're expecting a description, a predicate. When we hear a man is a man, we're experiencing the denial of all of those expectations. And that's how tautology means. It means by a denial of expectation. It means in the same way that laughter means. Now here's that section from, and it links to results that are just as deep, that liberation from expectation that enchains us, and that rigor ultimately is able to break those chains, right? Past cannot guarantee the future decides the past. The section in Phaleris's bull goes, a man, but we have not yet seen how, let's see, how does it start? A rose is a rose. Oh, in fact, there's an aphorism that preceded my writing of Phaleris's bull. The aphorism is, a rose is a rose. That's a man is a man. That's tautology. A rose is a rose, seemingly saying nothing. But the aphorism continues, a rose is a rose. We anticipate other predicates. We don't anticipate a rose is a rose. We anticipate a rose is red. A rose is a flower. A rose is a plant, something. Not a rose. It means through a denial of expectation. It means as humor. It means as a liberation from expectation. So, a rose is a rose. Oh, actually, just to make sure I say this right, okay. A rose is a rose, as everyone knows, but what deeper truths do tautologies disclose? With Cordelia dead and through tears that burn, Lear will discern as best he can that a man is a man. And this will have taken a lifetime to learn. But we have not yet seen how tautologies mean. Let's study an ocean in slow motion. A man is what? Tall, strong, a warrior, an heir, here, near, over there. As Eckhart's daughter, we can only stare and answer a man against expectation of predication, common or rare. It means as humor by thwarting what we expect, denying our sense of what must come next. And knowledge is a demonstration of just such expectation, and its walls confine as prevarication, but rigor demurs, finding reason to doubt what we think must come about. As the past is a prison, and this the way out. We wallpaper the future with prints from the past and marvel that pain can last and last, as if guesswork were gain and rigor too plain, as if two things could ever be the same. But that they cannot is what we forgot in journeying far from Eden. So again, it's that liberation from expectation, the laughter. Whenever expectation is thwarted in a joke, we laugh. When we move beyond all of the presuppositions, which is what we're doing, when we move beyond the conceptualizations of our objective space based upon approximate forms from the past, we achieve the liberation that is signified, well, in the case of Buddhism, by laughter. And in the case of entering epistemic space, by laughter, and tears, and chills, a powerfully emotional experience. You know, it's said within the Buddhist tradition that one does not appreciate the depth of one's suffering, how bad this has been, how bad this fundamentally is, without the understanding of the nature of enlightenment, without the ability to perceive nirvana, to understand, the truth of the Buddhist formulations, that one doesn't appreciate how bad, how much suffering this really is until one has reached the further shore. And at that moment of reaching the further shore within the Buddhist tradition, that moment of experiencing enlightenment, then one can look back at the horror, but one has left it behind, and then one is released. And that release can be expressed as laughter, right? It's the laughter of the gods that see through to the true nature of our circumstance, that we suffer not the reality, but our claims, our unjustifiable claims, our representations, our premature representations. We bring it upon ourselves. Rigor frees us. Laughter can be its accompaniment. That's the epistemic role of laughter, right? Not the societal role, not the role that Bergson was pointing to, not laughing at people, not humiliating them, but embracing the true nature of our circumstance and its dignity, which is a liberation from circumstance. Now, as always, I have more things that I plan to discuss than I have time to discuss. I wanted to make the comment, I've mentioned in the past Meister Eckhart, that Christian mystic, and that sermon, Meister Eckhart's daughter, where she characterizes herself as a something among somethings. And so I go, that's funny, right? That's a denial of all the categorizations that people would normally view her in terms of, as a woman, or as a girl, or as a human being, or as a helper, as a daughter, whatever the roles happen to be. No, she is rejecting them and their expectations in terms of, well, in the case of Meister Eckhart, mystical union with God, but we can represent that experience as the logic, the rigor of the epistemic, where categories vanish, are not supportable within that space. So again, there's humor there, there's laughter, there's the potential for that liberation from every mode and manner of constraint that is presumed. Remember, we suffer that we presume more than we know to the end of time. The liberation from that can evoke laughter. That's epistemic laughter, not, again, Bergson's heuristic role of laughter as a corrective. There's a book that I was going to read. It's a short aphoristic book. I think I will give it. It gives the issues, the problem with that epistemic representation, the narrowness of that epistemic representation of laughing at. It doesn't mention laughter, but it's operating within the context that I've just been developing. Let me just read it. It's an aphoristic book. Again, it's hard to understand these fully, especially when you hear them quickly, but the sound, I think, helps communicate. And I want to just share these kind of works as well. In some instances, an individual aphorism from one of these works may provide a kind of immediate understanding. The book is called Social Spaces, right? So we're dealing with heuristic spaces. We're dealing with the kind of spaces in which Bergson feels laughter is an appropriate, a valuable corrective of eccentric behavior, right? Preface. Tragic spaces are heuristic domains. It's where we suffer. Liberation from suffering is the epistemic rigor. We suffer that we presume more than we know, right? Tragedy as society is a tool. Epistemics obviate tragedy, right? Epistemic space does not support the presuppositions that maintain the claims, the assumptions, the expectations that supports a tragic space. We suffer the imprecisions of social spaces, right? The imprecisions that support language itself, that make comparisons possible. But comparisons are always superficial, always imprecise. The kind of comparisons that people engage in all the time in social media, those kinds of damaging comparisons. Rough representation debases. Mortality is society. The concept of death is a societal one in the sense that we can't see the world from the outside. We can't experience our death from outside the world. It doesn't have epistemic reality. We see darkly in others less than ourselves. Sketchbooks of worlds poetically console. We understudy tragically every role. The point is, again, these are highly concentrated, they're poetic, so they're not just aphoristically concentrated, but poetically concentrated. So doubly dense, right? Compact. But you get a feel for, again, the tragic is, well, the type of view that Bergson is supporting the tragic, right? To laugh at someone, to humiliate someone is to conduce towards the tragic. That is itself an element of a tragic domain. That the possibility of that humiliation, and again, not supportable by the rigor of our circumstance, which is stronger than those correctives. Again, simply the thing I am shall make me live, as Shakespeare said, right? Our dignity is always inviolate because it's always grounded in the rigor of our circumstance, that we exist in difference, in distinction from everything else. And so any comparisons are instrumental or superficial, are not rigorously supportable. Now, I think at the end, I wanted to make a few little comments before I get to the questions from last time. One of the roles of laughter, of humor, is in the context of works that juxtapose the tragic and the comic. The depth of suffering and despair and the liberation that laughter can signify. We see this in various forms in the world of art. We see it, in a sense, in the development of, the piano works of Beethoven, where in his piano sonatas, there's an increasing separation of hands. So the low notes and the high notes become increasingly disparate, but he's able to maintain the integrity of the work given his increasing understanding of form, the requirements of form, as his career develops. To support that increasing separation, the depth of tragedy, the height of comedy, of laughter. You see that in Shakespeare, right? That even plays like King Lear have their comic moments, comic elements. You see it in a film which at one time was the film that I most admired, really talked about as having most successfully combined and controlled a whole range of disparate experiences, representations. An American Werewolf in London, which combines the mythos of a werewolf, romance, comedy, humor, tragedy, horror, all in one short 90-minute film, roughly. I think it was not too long. That experience of Buddhist nirvana, right? Laughter preceding enlightenment, represents such a juxtaposition of extremes, right? At the moment of enlightenment, one sees the full depth of horror of one's circumstance. And the laughter transcends it. But it's also occasioned by the recognition of what we have now gone beyond, right? So laughter at its highest is capable of conjoining most effectively with horror at its deepest. That's what's happening within that moment of true Buddhist realization. The full horror is recognized, and the full exhilaration, the full transcendence of the transfiguration that the understanding achieves. There's a famous, we have this tradition of gallows humor, right? That under horrific circumstances, we often go to humor. It provides a corrective. It provides a perspective. When I was in medical school dissecting a cadaver, well, there was a lot of humor that was being exchanged, at the dissecting table. It was, again, gallows humor. It was a response. Now, it wasn't an epistemic response yet, right? I had not yet developed, that level or depth of response to that situation, but it was an emotional response and corrective. It's one of the most, but again, that juxtaposition of the comic and the tragic, laughter with an extremity of pain, is as compelling a juxtaposition as human life affords. One of the most celebrated involves Damiens, the attempted assassin of Louis XV of France. Damiens attempted the assassination with a knife. It was not successful, and the result was horrific in terms of the penalty that Damiens had to pay. He was tortured to death. I think, in one account, over a period of 4 days, tortured to death. Malraux actually references it in Anti-Memoirs. But what's most remarkable is a comment that Damiens made as he is being led to the torture chamber, or being led to wherever the first day of torture is to be executed. He says to his attendants, "It's going to be a hard day." Well, now that type of juxtaposition one also finds in the work of Mark Twain. Mark Twain is one of America's greatest writers. one of America's greatest novelists, one of America's greatest sensibilities, one of the world's greatest sensibilities, one of the greatest of all comic writers, writers of works that are humorously grounded, that embrace humor at a high level. There's an award in the United States, an annual humor award to an outstanding comedic figure. It's the Mark Twain Award. He's one of the world's greatest comic writers of any culture. But he also displays the deepest sensibility, the deepest heart, the deepest sense of the pathos that is in balance with the laughter that his writings evoke. The one example I like to give, it's the opposite example. He wrote a work, it's a short story called The Diary of Adam and Eve. And it's one of the funniest things he wrote. And he has Adam and Eve, kind of coming to terms with this new world that they find themselves in. And Adam is somewhat bumbling and not quite as intelligent as he imagines himself to be. And Eve sees through him, but loves him. And so she accepts, all of his limitations. It's funny, it's endearing. It's, again, one of my favorite works of Mark Twain, one of his funniest, consistently funniest. But it ends with the loss of Eden. And it ends, after all of this humor, all of this laughter that it evokes, with one of the greatest lines that I have ever read. And the line is, this is on, Adam says, this is on Eve's tombstone, years after the loss of Eden. Adam has lived after Eve's death. Wheresoever Eve was, actually it goes wheresoever she was, but I like to say it, wheresoever Eve was, there was Eden. So you see that depth of emotion that's juxtaposed with the laughter. Those two are conjoined. The one makes the other possible. And one of my favorite instances that shows the transition from the limited aspect of humor, of laughter, to its transcendent aspect, in 2 words, is something that is from his work, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. And it's actually in a plaque. What I'm going to read you is on a plaque on a sidewalk in New York City, leading up to, I think, the New York Public Library, where they have short excerpts, a line or two, from famous writings. There are a large number of them, dozens of them, on the sidewalk, one after the other. One night, when I was in New York, I went and I read, I think, just about all of them. But the one that was most memorable, the one that encapsulates so much of what I'm saying here about the nature of laughter and its deep significance, its philosophic significance, its epistemic, its transformative power, not its heuristic, not its corrective power, not its power to humiliate, but its power to liberate, is from Mark Twain. It's from Connecticut Yankee, and let me just show it to you, and then I'm going to read it. Okay, and then I'm going to go to the questions. Oh God, I'm running out of time again. Okay, it's okay, don't worry. Okay, so here's Mark Twain. And here's what the plaque, you can't read that plaque, I'm going to read, here's what the plaque looks like. It's, I think, stainless steel in the sidewalk of New York City. And what it says is, remember, this is it's a time travel work where a young man from Connecticut has awakened in King Arthur's England, like 1,000 years earlier in the Middle Ages. And and he's just arrived, but he doesn't know where he is. Okay, and he meets someone who is guiding him to, well, through the countryside. And again, he doesn't know where he is. He thinks he's still, maybe he should be, right, in Connecticut. There's a town in Connecticut called Bridgeport. It goes, at the end of an hour, we saw a faraway town sleeping in a valley by a winding river. And beyond it on a hill, a vast gray fortress with towers and turrets, the first I had ever seen out of a picture. Bridgeport, said I, pointing. Camelot, said he. Bridgeport, that's funny, right? Camelot, that's the medieval equivalent of Eden, of a perfect world, a perfect society, a perfect place, the ultimate goal, the holy grail, Camelot. Bridgeport, said I. Camelot, said he. Okay, now I want to turn to the questions very quickly. Oh God, once again, I didn't allow enough time. Okay, let me, I've got to do more, I've got to do this better. Okay, what do you think about the perspective of a profession of human resources management? Okay, remember, when we're talking about human resources in a societal context, we're talking about heuristics. So we are talking about the value that an individual can bring to an enterprise, to a societal role, to a goal that we are trying to achieve. The opposite or the other aspect is the singularity of that individual, the dignity of that individual, and the singular qualities, characteristics, tendencies, impulses that individual can bear. The greatest fulfillment of human potential, even in a heuristic context, is through the embrace and the recognition of the epistemic, of the singularity of all that individual can bring, not just the possibility of that individual satisfying a narrow role. I know that's a fast answer, but it actually does encompass the main, I think, issue. Now again, quickly, what kind of philosophical questions of human resource issues are actual now? The most important issue is to what degree the individual circumstances, distinctions, differences can be marshaled to ends so that dignity is preserved, the individual is able to flourish, even as that individual is able to contribute to a societal enterprise. And that's a matter partly of trying to evoke from the individual, what that individual most admires, right? Because that's what can most engage that person and most lead to fruitful results that society can most benefit from. So it's, again, not seeing individuals as components, as machinery, but as seeing them that can sort of be tailored to a specific role, but that can bring all of their distinctiveness to form and forge greater roles, realize greater capabilities. And finally, I know I'm rushing. The role of human resources in developing international relationships and solving global problems, for example, the USA and Kazakhstan. Again, it's a matter of recognizing that our differences are things of value. Our differences are those things through which we exist at all. And our differences, our distinctions, the different ways, the different cultural ways that people from Kazakhstan might approach a problem, or people from the United States might approach a problem, can be embraced and can be valued and can be amplified for the greater good of the global community. I saw a YouTube video not long ago where people from Kazakhstan were commenting upon the conflict in Ukraine. And these were just random people from the street, apparently, but their comments, their assessments were as cogent as any I heard in any context by anyone on television, any commentator, any journalist, whose accounts or whose assessments I read, just ordinary people from the streets of Almaty. So, we want to, cherish the distinctiveness of our circumstance, that those individual circumstances are capable of contributing more to the greater good than any tailoring of circumstances to more narrow visions or ends. Okay, well, I know I kind of rushed through that, but I hope that gives a sense of my feelings about those issues, again, in a philosophical context. I'm always trying to address these things philosophically.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for an amazing talk as always, and also for showing your pictures and answering all the questions. We also have some questions, and we would like to thank our audience. Thank you very much for your feedback, for your likes and your views, which we'll appreciate it. And also, Yerkin. Hello, Professor. We're glad to see you again.
Thank you for joining us again. Yes, thank you.
Then, probably it's what do you think? What do you think about Yuval Harari theory, humanism, biometric determinism, freedom of philosophy? Thank you very much for your question. And then thank you for the fundamental explanation. Thank you for your feedback. One more time, dear audience, thank you very much for your questions. Please make sure to write your comments and feedback in the section. We'll definitely address them next week. And thank you very much, Stephen, for being with us weekly. We truly appreciate our talks. And thank you very much, everyone. Stay safe and see you all next week.
Thank you again, Elia, and thank everybody for participating and for watching, and join us next week. Yes.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye now.